Good morning, subscribers. Geekonomics here once again. Just bringing you a few more thoughts with regard to the GCSE A593 stimulus material. So I'm pretty much well through now, figures 1 to 4, and I've been trying to keep these videos up to date with that as we go through. So the last thing I was looking at with my students was the relationship, if there is a relationship that is, between this chart, which shows the current account deficit getting progressively worse, as we've mentioned in previous videos, and this chart, which shows the exchange rate. And so my students and I, we've just been thinking to ourselves, does this echo, mirror, reinforce what is going on in figure 1? So does the movement in the exchange rate, does that back up, and is that one of the reasons why we've seen this continuous deterioration in the current account? Because look at the time periods, ladies and gentlemen, 06 to 2016, 06 through to 2016, beginning of 17. So very similar time periods. I would not be in the least bit surprised if you get a question which asks you to relate this chart to the previous chart. So let's just have a little think about this, ladies and gentlemen, and see what we can maybe come up with here. So one of the things that you'll obviously need to do, and this may be a very simple question that you'll be asked on the paper, is that you may be asked to simply describe what is going on with the exchange rate from Jan 2006 to January 2007. So that's fairly straightforward, obviously. So here we can see that £1 is buying you approximately, let's call it, $1.75. Then we hit the real sort of heyday for people traveling to America when you could get $2 for your pound. That was when we saw people jetting off to the States with empty suitcases and coming back with those suitcases full of clothes because it was such a bargain even to pay the flight cost to America and then return home armed with lots of designer goods, designer clothing from the States because it was so cheap back then. That really was the time to be heading off to the States on your holidays. And now fast forward to Jan 2017, where £1 is buying you approximately, $1.25, something like that, according to this data. So we can see here that we have had, over the course of this time period, we have a depreciation of one of the currencies, and of course that currency is pound sterling, because the pound, instead of buying you $1.17, now it'll only buy you $1.25, so the pound is depreciated there. Now let's think about what happens to the price of exports and imports when a currency depreciates. And the golden rule, ladies and gentlemen, and the one which I'm always hammering, trying to get my students to remember, is that the export price always follows the currency movement. So if the currency, in this instance sterling, depreciates, that means that UK export prices fall. So as a consequence of this movement, this depreciation, ladies and gentlemen, we would anticipate the price of exports would be falling. Now, all other things remaining equal and all other things constant, and we'll come back to this shortly, and we do refer to this in economics with that well-known phrase, ceteris paribus, all other things remaining equal. That ought to result in the demand for exports going up, because they're cheaper. So why wouldn't they go up, you would think, logically? That's the normal law of demand, isn't it? As price falls, demand rises. And the flip side of the same coin is, of course, if export prices are falling, then import prices are rising. So PM, just write this somewhere you can see it, price of imports would be rising, and ceteris paribus, The price of something goes up, the demand falls. Demand for imports should fall. So these two things ought to be happening as a consequence of this depreciation of the currency. Now, think to yourself then, what would that do to the position of the current account balance? So you're going to sell more exports. Demand for exports goes up, so hopefully the value of exports will go up as well. You're going to sell fewer imports, so therefore the value of imports falls, and consequently, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you're thinking to yourselves, oh well actually, surely that would lead to the current account deficit shrinking. Surely that would lead to the current account moving more towards surplus. And indeed you'd be correct, ladies and gentlemen. So this depreciation of the currency, which ought to reduce the size of the current account deficit, but we know, if we move this back up, actually the current account deficit has got bigger, not smaller. So now you need to be thinking to yourself, okay, well, why might that be the case? And let's tell the examiner, let's evaluate why that might be the case. So let's, ladies and gentlemen, just have a think about a few things which might result in the current account deficit getting worse, even though we've got this depreciation happening and these movements in the price of exports and imports. So let's just think of a few reasons why that might be, ladies and gentlemen. Let's think about those things together. So number one, we've just come out of a global recession and economies are recovering globally. And as a consequence of that, foreigners, they don't have a lot of disposable income with which they can buy our imports. So for them it would be an import, it would be our exports. And so even though the exports are cheaper, they may not have the disposable income. So we're going to talk about YD here, the disposable income. They may not have that disposable income to buy the cheaper exports. So even though they're cheaper, people still don't have, and they're not confident to spend and buy our exports. So that could be one reason. Okay? Secondly, what else could be going on in the economy? Let's sort of ignore now this ceteris paribus assumption, all other things being equal. Well, at the same time as exchange rates are forcing the price of exports downwards, if we have inflationary pressures in the economy, that can counterbalance that. So let's say the currency depreciates by a few percent. Well, if inflation rises by a few percent, that will offset the price reduction in our exports, and hence, again, you may not see an increase in demand and therefore no increase in value. So think about P, ladies and gentlemen, with a little hat on it, which I like to use for my symbol for inflation. Domestic inflationary pressures may offset that competitive advantage that you gain whenever the currency depreciates. So that could be another reason why you don't sell your exports. Thirdly, oftentimes, although I'm not saying that this is the case for the UK, but oftentimes cheap can mean poor quality. And people aren't daft, they know what's good and they know what's not good. And so if they are cheap, but cheap and nasty, then in spite of the fact that they're cheaper, you won't find that you'll be selling any more of them. So again, you might find that there are certain quality control issues or quality control measures being enforced by our savvy consumers abroad, which means that they still won't buy them. So it's another factor which may offset this. So that's all sort of thinking about the reasons why exports might not go up. Let's have a think maybe about some of the reasons why imports might not drop off in demand even though they're more expensive. So as my students keep telling me, we are an island nation. 2/3, ladies and gentlemen, 2/3 of everything that we import is a RM, a raw material. Oil, gas, etc. Well, you can't just stop bringing these things in even though they are more expensive. And so actually, if the price of them goes up and we continue to import the same number, then actually the value of the imports will go up. And so that has this terrible knock-on effect on the value of imports, pushing that current account deficit wider and wider and wider. So that's a very significant factor, ladies and gentlemen. This whole notion of not just the quantity of our imports, but also the nature of the things that we are importing. So it's a very significant factor. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, I will leave it at that. So there's a few reasons why, ladies and gentlemen, in spite of the fact that we see this depreciation, which ought to narrow the size of the current account and maybe move it more towards surplus, at least reduce the deficit, there are a few reasons as to why that's not happened. And we're finishing here by saying that this movement in the exchange rate does not necessarily reflect what you see on figure 1, and there are other extenuating circumstances. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you've managed to watch to the end of this video, thank you very much for doing so. It's half term for me next week, so it'll probably be a quiet week on the video front. If you've got any questions, then do get in touch, hello@geekonomics.co.uk. If you want to keep up to date with the most up-to-date video releases, then click the bell below so you can get all the notifications of the alerts. They're all posted on Twitter, so do follow me on Twitter. And you can get up-to-date exemplar materials and things via my website. If you go geekonomics.co.uk/resources, and I'll try and keep those resources up to date, certainly more up to date than I have been doing lately. And the other thing I'll just mention is I'm hoping in the next number of weeks to put out a live Q&A, starting first of all with a Q&A on this specification, the GCSE stimulus material specifically. So if you'd be interested in that, give it a little comment below or maybe a little thumbs up or something so we can sort of garner the interest, and then we'll take it from there. So if you're on half term, I hope you're enjoying it. If you're on half term next week, I hope you have a great time, and I'll see you all in a week's time. Bye for now.